Next presenter, Rabbi Dr. Eddie Reichman. Rabbi Reichman is the professor of emergency medicine and bioethics at Montefiore Medical Center and Albert Einstein College of Medicine, where he teaches Jewish medical ethics. He's a world expert in halacha and medicine, and it's really a delight to be able to ask Rabbi Dr. Eddie Reichman, who's a tremendous Talmud Chacham, to share with us Precedented Times, Rabbinic Responses to Pandemics of the Past, a historic perspective.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Muskin. Tremendous chus to join you, and kol hakavod for coordinating this amazing program. There's really no better way to celebrate Kabbalas HaTorah than to see the continued application of the Torah to all circumstances. And in fact, a number of your speakers today have addressed what is the most pressing issue in the modern era, the most contemporary topic, a topic which is on all our minds, and that is of course, the coronavirus pandemic. And what I'd like to do today, in the title, which you'll see in a moment as I share my screen with you, the title, which is not a misprint, is Precedented Times, the Rabbinic Response to Pandemics Throughout the Ages. The one word which you have probably heard the most in description of these extraordinary and tragic and challenging times has been unprecedented. And indeed, this pandemic is unprecedented in many, many ways. You see before you COVID-19 today, and this is literally today from just an hour or two ago, 5.5 million people confirmed infected, 350,000 people tragically have lost their lives to this pandemic. Never before have we seen a pandemic affect the entire globe simultaneously to such an extent as this has. But I'd like to focus in our discussion about the precedented and unprecedented aspects about the Jewish response to pandemics. And there are indeed many unprecedented dimensions of the Jewish response. And one of them you see reflected in this slide before you, as well as in the conference, the beautiful conference that you have coordinated for us today. And that is the halachic response from across the globe that is proceeding in real time. Back in the centuries of the past, we'll talk about pandemics of the past. Poskim most assuredly addressed halachic issues, but we only found out many, many years later, sometimes decades later, when their works were published. Today, we are seeing the halachic response unfold before our very eyes. We have the Gedolei Poskim, Rav Asher Weiss, has written a 170-page book, which is continuing to expand on Corona. We have Piskei Corona from Rav Herschel Schachter Shlita, and of course the two extraordinary presenters that you had the zchus of having today, Rabbi Dr. Steinberg and Rabbi Ramon, have contributed tremendously to the ongoing halachic issues that relate to this pandemic. But pandemic itself is not unprecedented. There have been many pandemics throughout the millennia. And here is a list of some of the major pandemics dating back thousands of years, to the Antonine Plague, to the Plague of Justinian in the 500s, to plagues which you are more familiar with, the Black Death in the 1300s, to the Italian Plague of 1629 to 1631, for which we will in a moment see halachic responses, to cholera pandemics, 6 in total, which spanned over 100 years, from the 1800s to the early 1900s, and others in the modern era as well. What I'm going to do in the time we have today is to contrast the contemporary Piskei Halacha with the Piskei Corona, if you will, from the modern era. And here you see a picture of me in my hazmat suit. I am an emergency physician here in New York at Montefiore Medical Center, one of the major centers in New York. Just last week, we discharged our 5,000th Corona patient. And we will talk about the Piskei Corona, the contemporary Piskei Halacha today, and we'll contrast each one of them to Piskei pre-Corona, if you will, in the times prior to Corona. And here you see the plague physician not dissimilar to the contemporary hazmat suit covering hands, body, feet, and head. It is just a few months ago, and it's hard to believe, that the World Health Organization declared a pandemic. There is a definition of pandemic. Pandemic is when disease spreads from a local geographic location outside its location to other countries. Clearly, this is a pandemic of global proportions. But if we turn our eyes back and to see how Chazal dealt with these issues, we find a similar definition. Actually, in the Gemara itself, in Maseches Tainis, the Gemara says, "V'chein ir sheyesh bo dever." If the city is afflicted with dever or plague, which comes from dever in the Torah of the Eser Makos, oso ir misano o musras. That city fasts, and that city blows shofar. But how do you define plague? So the Gemara gives you a threshold. It gives the Talmudic definition of what constitutes plague. Ezehu dever, ir hamotzia chamesh mios ragli, a city which can produce 500 foot soldiers. It is that size of demographically. The yatsumi menu shlosha mesing b'shlosha yamim ze'achar zeh, and 3 people died, one on each of 3 consecutive days from this plague. And if it reaches that threshold, harei zeh dever, pachos mikan ein zeh dever. If it doesn't reach that threshold, we do not activate the pandemic, and we do not fast, and we do not blow shofar. Sheltering in place is an expression that we have all become familiar with. In New York, we have not had an official shelter-in-place order, but we have all been, in essence, confined to our homes. If you turn again to the Gemara from Bava Kama, Tanu Rabbanon, Dever Bo'ir, Kanes Raglecha. When there's a plague in the city, gather your feet, which means stay at home and don't go outside, lest you become afflicted from the contagion of the plague. But in fact, throughout the course of halachic history, there has been debate as to whether one should kanes reglecha and one should shelter in place, or whether one should flee. And in fact, the Ramah in Yeridea writes, Od kasu sheyesh livroach min ha'ir, kisheyesh dever ba'ir, v'yesh lotzeis min ha'ir, b'tchilas ha'dever v'lo b'sofa. The Ramah himself writes, one should flee the city and not stay in the city. And in fact, he acted on his own words, and in the midst of an epidemic, he himself writes, he left Krakow and went to the city of Shidlov, where he was suffering greatly and had to struggle in order to get even food and water for his family. It is there that he wrote Sefer Mechir Yain on Megillas Esther, and he wrote it in this introduction. He writes in lieu of Shalach Manos for his father-in-law, because he simply didn't have the ability to obtain anything to send him. So instead, he sent him a Sefer Mechir Yain and Megillas Esther. Wearing a mask is something that we're all familiar with today. Leave it to the Israelis to design a mask which opens up in the center with a remote control, so you can actually eat while you're using the mask. Is there a precedent for mask in the rabbinic literature? So here you have from Tzaras about Tzarua, Ein bo asher bo hanega. What is he supposed to do? How is he supposed to proceed and behave? Bigadav yufrumim rosho yefarua ve'al safam ya'ateh. What is the translation for the Tzarua, one afflicted with Tzaras, which is a disease? It's a physical disease. He shall cover over his lip. How does the Ibn Ezra interpret that? Ve'atam shelo yazik beruach piv. He should cover his mouth so he shouldn't spread the disease to other people. And in fact, the Chafetz Chaim in Hilchos Tisha B'Av writes, it was a time of a pandemic of cholera, and he was talking about fasting. And he writes in this context, if someone wants to fast, he should stay at home and fast at home. But if he does go out, Yisa saviv lechatmo upiv chatichat camphor. He should put around his nose and his mouth a piece of camphor. Camphor is a material, a wax-like material with a potent smell, was actually used from times of antiquity to fend off the plague. So in essence, he should wear a mask of camphor in order to protect himself. Coronavirus and isolation, the tragic reality of this very contagious disease. If someone is afflicted with disease, they have to stay in isolation. And this is the CDC's definition. Isolation is used to separate people infected from the virus from people who are not infected with the virus. Here also, we have a precedent from Tsaras, and we'll soon turn to actual plagues and see that there's precedent from actual plagues throughout Jewish history. But kol yemei asher hanega bo yitma tamehu badad yeshev mechutz lamachane. The tzarua, afflicted with a disease, has to sit in isolation. What does the Das Zakeni Balatosa say? Lefisha oso choli mitpashet bibnei adam haragili metzlo. Because of contagion, he has to sit in isolation for fear of contagion. But I now draw your attention to one of the most extraordinary Jewish works relating to plague, and it's a work written by Avram Catalano in the 17th century, who was a physician who lived in the city of Padua. He wrote a sefer called Olam Hafuch, World in Upheaval, in the midst of the bubonic plague of 1631. In essence, it's a diary of his personal experiences as one of the leaders of the community, guiding every aspect of the community, from the medical health to the finances to the religious observance. And with respect, and we will refer to this a few more times during the course of our discussion today, but he wrote, with respect to the issue of isolation, we in the Jewish community began to build our own Lazaretto. Lazaretto is a word which you will find in some tshuva literature. What is a Lazaretto? Lazaretto was a house specifically designed for people afflicted with plague, and they would be sent there to remain in isolation. And the health officers at that time told them that if they didn't build their own Lazaretto, the Jews would be required to stay in the city Lazaretto. They wouldn't have access to kosher food, they wouldn't have access to other things. And we'll see other shilas came up with respect to Lazarettos and isolation as well. Quarantine. Quarantine is different than isolation. Quarantine is used to keep someone who might have been exposed, in this case to COVID-19, away from others. And here likewise from the Olam Hafuch of Avram Catalano, from 1631 in Padua of the plague of bubonic plague. He writes, he gives great detail about every individual who was afflicted with the disease and who tragically lost their life from the disease. And I'm reading here in my English translation, then Emmanuel Bono fell ill in buboes, which is a very specific physical finding. That's why it's called bubonic plague. There's skin findings, large lumps in the skin that are discolored and sometimes weeping infectious material were seen near his ear. Eliyahu Francisi attended him, and Bono subsequently tragically died. Francisi was then quarantined. Then the wife of Menachem Minkin died, and her household was quarantined. Then others passed away, and they unfortunately, Rahman al-Islam, had to be quarantined as well. Closing of the houses of worship. We are having this conference not in our shuls, unfortunately, but virtually through the internet, through Zoom, because our shuls are closed. New York City mayor to synagogues closed for coronavirus or be shut down permanently. In Eretz Yisrael, they closed the synagogues. One of the unprecedented dimensions is that shuls are closed virtually across the globe, something which has never occurred in the course of history. But shul closures itself is not unprecedented. In the past, there have been shul closures. And here you have a plague from the 1500s in Venice, where 15,000 people lost their lives from this plague. And the son of the Maharami Padua, Shmuel Yehuda Katznelbogen, writes in his hesped, he gave a hesped for a man by the name of Zalman Katz from Mantua in Italy. And he writes, Hesped Assisi b'chotzer haget. I delivered this eulogy, this hesped, in the courtyard of the ghetto. Ki kol bate knesios hayu segurim mipnei hamagefa, because all the shuls were closed because of the plague. And we'll see a further precedent in just a moment. Today, people trying, even though the shuls are closed, trying to obtain their mitzvos and some contact in ways which are amenable given the potential contagion. And here you see one example. On Purim, a Chabad rabbi is reading the Megillah for a Jew. The rabbi is sitting in the courtyard, and the Jew is peeking out the window. We have remarkable precedent to this from a Sefer Otzer HaChaim written by Yaakov Tzahalon in Rome, who was both a physician and a very prominent Rav at that time. And he writes in his medical book, Otzer HaChaim, in the context of his discussion of this particular plague, since the people were unable to come to the synagogue on Shabbos Parshas Toldos, November 18th, 1656, I, Yaakov Tzahalon, delivered a sermon at the corner of Catalani Street from the window of the home of David Gattini. And on another occasion, I delivered another drasha on Tuscany Street. And you see this is clearly a precedented concept. And Tzahalon himself writes additional restrictions that were given to the people in the ghetto. A Lazaretto was established for the infected patients. It was not permitted for anyone to leave their homes except to visit a physician. At night, if you were not allowed out of your homes, and if you violated that particular law, you were placed in prison. But the final one, look at the punishment for this. People could not congregate. A gallows was built near the gate of the ghetto to punish those who violated this rule. And here is a picture of that actual gallows. Here is the gate to the ghetto of Rome, and you can see here, this is actually the gallows sitting in the square as a deterrent for people to violate that law to congregate during the times of the plague. One of the most interesting debates in contemporary halachic literature and internet discussions and discussions by everybody these days is the participation in these balcony minyanim. Can you participate in a balcony minyan? And here you have tshuva of Rav Shechter and a tshuva of Rav, who's not a fan of the balcony minyanim, and a tshuva of Rav Asher Weiss. Is there precedent for this? So here you have a fascinating tshuva by the Chidah in the late 1700s of Chaim Yosef David Azulai, one of the greatest gedolim of his time. What was the shaila to him? Imagine the shaila. There were two groups of people who wanted to join for a minyan. 4 of them were in one house and 6 were in another. But one of those houses was a Lazaretto. One of those houses was an isolation house where the victims of the plague were, and they could not leave, and there was a guard standing at the door. However, they could see the people in the other house. Could they be mitzvah for a minyan or not? And he actually paskined in this case that they could. I'm not sure how he would have paskined today, but he paskined in that particular case that they could. Synagogues and social distancing, words which we have, phrases which we have now become all familiar with. Is a remarkable picture of the Kotel, social distancing during Birchas Kohanim. Was there social distancing in pre-modern times? So there's examples of both informal social distancing and formal social distancing. And here's an example of informal social distancing, again from Dr. Avram Catalano and Olam Afuch. In the Padua ghetto, he writes, "Then we decreed that in order to maintain distance between the people during davening, the unmarried men would occupy the chutzner of the Ashkenazi shul, and those who usually prayed in the Italian shul would occupy the women's section." And there weren't that many people, so they were all starved together in one shul. For those of you who visit Padua today, the Ashkenazi shul is no longer a functioning shul. It's actually been converted into the Jewish Museum of the city of Padua. But the Italian shul is literally just a few steps down the road. There's also formal social distancing. Remarkable how similar this sounds to what we are experiencing today. In my view, this is a tshuva of Rabbi Akiva Eger, writing during the midst of one of the major cholera pandemics in 1830. And he writes, "In my view, it is true that gathering in a small space is inappropriate, that it is possible to pray in groups, each one very small, about 15 people altogether. The group should begin with the first light, and then another group, and each one should have a designated time to come and pray there, etc., etc." And he even writes that you should perhaps use a guard from the police to oversee this, because people will push their way into the shul because out of their desire to daven with a minyan. Lottery. If you read the papers, you will see that in order to daven at the Kotel for Shavuos, you have to choose a lottery ticket in the hopes that you will win the lottery and be able to daven there. This exact notion was used by Rabbi Akiva Eger in the Beis Din of Posen, again in this this cholera pandemic, for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. We're coming up on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, and we're all wondering what we're going to do for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. So they suggested very detailed guidelines, fascinating guidelines. Only half the seats should be occupied, but if you have half the seats, that means half the shul can't attend. So they suggested that half the shul come to Rosh Hashanah and half the shul come to Yom Kippur. And there was a lottery to determine who attends Rosh Hashanah and who attends on Yom Kippur. And again, military police should guard the entrances and check the tickets. They restricted the times of davening. They said no additional aliyahs to the Torah. And these are suggestions which people would like, even not in the midst of a pandemic. Chazan should not prolong the service with tunes and chazanas. But these are things which they instituted at that time. This was halacha l'maisa. This was not hypothetical stuff. This was how they responded to times of pandemic. Should a physician attend a minyan when he walks out of the hospital? So Rav Asher Weiss says physicians, when they immediately come out of the hospital, obviously if they've washed and they've showered, or if it's been a while since they've been in the hospital, they can be mitzvah for the minyan. But a physician in the hospital going to a minyan, or coming out of the hospital to go to a minyan, should he be mitzvah? And he said no, they shouldn't be mitzvah for the minyan because of concern of contagion if they treated patients with infectious diseases. Same exact shaila was asked in the 19th century. Say in Nishmas Kol Chai, a rabbi in Izmir was asked if a plague physician could attend the minyan, and the people in the shul complained he might spread the disease, and he paskin no, he should not be attending the shul. Bikur Cholim today is another sefer Yad Amim by Rabbi Taharani in Eretz Yisrael. Says it's usher to do Bikur Cholim because of the concern of contagion. Back in the 1700s, this is from the Bikur Cholim Society of Berlin. And they write here that we accept upon ourselves, we will visit everybody unless they have infectious or contagious disease. What diseases do they mention by name specifically? Pakin, smallpox, and mazalin, measles, amongst others. It was just a year ago, we were dealing with measles in the Jewish community, and we thought that was a major issue and it created such problems. Little did we know that just a year later, we'd be dealing with something far more serious. Reburial after the pandemic, one of the tshuvas, and unfortunately, because of the tragic loss of life to so many people, this shaila has come up many times. If someone has a burial plot in Eretz Yisrael, they can't get to Eretz Yisrael. What do? Can they bury here in America and then subsequently reinter later on? And Rav Shechter says it's clearly the halacha is if the family is unable to bury, they can bury here temporarily, especially if they say it's bury al t'nai, and they can bury later on in Eretz Yisrael. This same exact shaila was dealt by our predecessors. It's a tshuva the Chassam Sofer. There was a special cemetery for the cholera pandemic because they didn't want to spread contagion and disease to other places. They wanted to maintain it in one geographic area. And he was asked the shaila, can these people be reinterred later in the kever avos in places where they had intended to be buried later on? Mourning practices have been altered in ways which we could never have anticipated. All of us, I'm sure, if we ourselves have not lost loved ones, we've had the opportunity to pay a Zoom Shiva visit, which has completely altered the whole notion of Shiva. And itself merits a extensive discussion. But how was Shiva dealt with in the pre-modern era? Shiva was dealt with in an interesting way. The Shulchan Aruch says, Yesh omrim b'shas hadever ein misadling. So the Mechaber says, in the times of plague, there should be no Shiva at all, not even a Zoom Shiva. Ein misadling mimshum biasusa, because of out of fear. And there's a machlokes exactly what that fear means. And Rav Malkiel Tannenbaum, the Divrei Malkiel, writes one possibility is the fear of contagion between the mourners and the Menachemim and those who come to console the mourners. But he says an interesting psychological issue. He says when so many people are sitting Shiva and there's announcements for so much Shiva, people will realize, this is a very serious plague, and the people themselves will fear. It'll affect their mental health, which will in turn affect their physical health. And we have seen that. We have seen newspapers. One newspaper here had literally 50 pages of obituaries, Reichman from people who have died from the corona disease, and it has an impact. Although today our motivation in this modern world really is the fear of contagion. And with this slide, we will close our session for today. This is a statement written back in the 1500s, which would be equally applicable today, as you will see, is written by a student of the Ramak, of Moshe Cordovero, and a student of the Arizal, Reburial de Vidas, and he wrote, "Magefa yishlucha meito yizbarach ba'avonosenu." HaKadosh Baruch Hu sends plague from time to time. Mizman l'zman hasher yamus banar v'zakein, where people die, young and old, taf nashim, women and children, bli siba, without us understanding the reason. U'b'chol lizen yizbalbel das harofim, and in this disease, whatever that disease may be, the physicians are confused, the physicians are befuddled. She'ein bahem mi sheyeda mitov v'adra, and they don't understand what is good about the treatment of the disease, what is bad about the treatment of the disease. This statement, despite our extraordinary advances in the 21st century, is just as applicable today as it was 500 years ago, despite what we would have thought based on as far as we have come in the world of science. So in conclusion, I hope in this brief presentation you realize that while there is much which is unprecedented, there is much which is indeed precedented in this pandemic. Our ancestors experienced many of the same things that we have experienced, and indeed, ein chadash tachas hashemesh. Hopefully, but the beautiful thing is that they have all, Klal Yisrael has survived all these previous pandemics, and Mirz Hashem, Klal Yisrael will survive this pandemic and continue to thrive. Hopefully, with God's help, it'll be the end of plagues and pandemics for all time, and all those who are in need of refuah should have refuah. Mirz Hashem, we shall have a wonderful Yontif and a wonderful Kabbalah Torah. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join you today.
Thank you, Rabbi Dr. Reichman. You should have a wonderful Yontif, and it was a delight. Thank you for giving us this historic perspective. Fascinating, really fascinating.
Thank you so much. Called to have a wonderful rest of the day.
In person in LA soon.
Looking forward.
Thank you. And